Today we examine one of the most epic chess games ever, a battle that lasted 4 days and was adjourned 3 times. For nearly 100 moves, the opponents fought with unbelievable willpower and determination. The game is full of deep strategic and tactical ideas, making every phase of the battle fascinating to follow. No wonder the players were the great Bobby Fischer, who would become world champion just 2 years later, and the 21-year-old Walter Browne, one of the most uncompromising fighters in chess, who had just earned the Grandmaster title and would later become a 6-time US champion. Browne once said, "If Bobby Fischer is the god of chess, I'm the devil." God and devil met only once in an official game, but what a game that was! Let's dive into it. Browne starts with e4 and Fischer plays the Alekhine defense, knight f6, attacking the pawn and provoking it to move forward. Alekhine's hyper-modern idea was to let his opponent build a monumental pawn center, gaining the space advantage, but later black is going to attack the center. And if white fails to hold it, his position will collapse. Knight d5, Browne increases his space advantage with d4 and Fischer immediately attacks the center with d6, attacking the e5 pawn. After knight f3, Fischer plays g6, preparing the fianchet of the bishop to attack the e5 pawn one more time. Now it's time to develop the king's bishop. Bishop c4 looks more natural, more active, but the c4 square belongs to the pawn, so Browne develops the bishop on e2. And after bishop g7, he pushes the c-pawn forward again with a tempo. So black is forced to make another move with the already developed piece, with the knight b6. However, the c4 pawn isn't safe, so it's defended only by the bishop, so it's already under pressure. And black might think about capturing on e5 next move, after which e5 would be weaker, the bishop's the bishop's activity would increase and the d-file would open. That's why, to prevent all this, white makes the best move, he captures on d6. And Fischer recaptures. So, white's main weakness is the d4 pawn, which is already attacked once, and black is going to attack it one more time with knight c6, and another idea black has is to eliminate one of the main defenders of the pawn, the f3 knight, by playing bishop g4. For this reason, it would have made sense for white to make a prophylactic move h3, which is the first line suggested by the engine. But Browne doesn't do it, he plays knight c3 instead, he keeps developing his pieces, and Fischer in his turn misses the opportunity of playing bishop g4 too, he castles kingside. And again, Browne doesn't play h3, which was the best move, instead he also castles. And Fischer again misses the chance of playing bishop g4 and develops the knight instead. It might seem that after knight c6, white could have pushed the pawn forward with a tempo again, increasing his space advantage, but d5 would have been a mistake because the weakness of the c4 pawn would tell in this case. Black would play knight a5, attacking the pawn for the second time, and it turns out that there is no way white can save this pawn. b3 is impossible because the knight falls. Queen d3 doesn't make any sense either because of bishop f5 with a tempo developing the bishop, and after the queen retreats the c4 pawn falls anyways. And finally, the only way of defending the pawn is the ugly move knight d2, which blocks the bishop, but actually it doesn't save the pawn either because the pawn is placed on the half open c-file. Black plays bishop d7 followed by rook c8 and the pawn falls. So, of course, Browne doesn't make this mistake, he doesn't play d5. He had the last chance of playing h3, but he doesn't play it either. Instead, he keeps developing his pieces, he plays bishop e3, and finally Fischer makes this move, bishop g4. And he creates an immediate threat of capturing on f3, and after bishop takes f3, the c4 pawn would fall. That's why Browne defends the pawn with b3. Fischer keeps attacking white's center. Actually, in this game, he executes Alekhine's idea very well. So he pushes the pawn forward, attacking c4 and creating a new threat of d takes c, b takes c, bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, and again the c4 pawn would fall. That's why Browne pushes the pawn forward, attacking the knight. We have reached the first critical position. By playing c5, Browne increases his space advantage and gets a pawn majority on the queen side. He has 3 pawns against black's 2 pawns, and this pawn majority can transform into a passed pawn later in the game. And he increases his space advantage. So at first sight, it might seem that white is much better, but it isn't the case. Because when playing d5, Fischer of course had foreseen white's most natural reply c5. And he has in mind a brilliant knight maneuver. So you can pause the video and try to find where Fischer retreats his attacked knight. The knight has only 2 squares, c8 and d7. d7 looks more natural, but c8 is much stronger, because it has a deep idea. d4 is white's main weakness, is attacked twice, and Fischer is going to attack it for the 3rd time with e6, and from c8 the knight will move to e7 and then to f5, increasing the pressure on the main weakness. That means white must do something urgently. Black's plan is clear. So what should white do? Of course, he has the pawn majority on the queen side, so his best move would have been b4, with the idea of b5, increasing his space advantage, kicking out the knight from c6, and on c6 the knight is greatly placed, it is attacking the d4 pawn, and it turns out that although the pawn is unguarded, if black captures it, it would be in white's favor, because after rook b1, white gets the pawn back after the knight retreats, b7 falls, the white rook invades the 7th rank, and the c5 pawn turns into a passed pawn. For this reason, of course, after b4, Fischer would have most probably played a6, after which white can continue with rook b1, followed by a4, preparing the b5 advance, and white would have retained a slight advantage. But instead of b4, Browne makes a mistake. He plays h3. But this move can be considered a loss of a tempo, because black was going to capture on f3 anyways. So that's exactly what Fischer does. He eliminates one of the main defenders of the d4 pawn. After bishop takes f3, d5 is under attack, but Fischer was going to play e6 anyways, defending the pawn and vacating the e7 square for the knight. Now again, the position has become now absolutely equal. White has lost the opening advantage, and he could have played b4 with the same idea, and the position would have remained equal. But instead, Browne plays queen d2, natural looking developing move, but after that, black completely seizes the initiative. Fischer plays the intended knight e7. He is ready to invade the f5 square, attacking d4 for the 3rd time, and the engine says that the best thing white can do is to make a passive move, knight e2, reinforcing the pawn. However, Browne was an ambitious player. He was 21-year-old man who had just received the Grandmaster title, and he wanted to beat Fischer. So instead of passive knight e2, he plays knight b5. He notices that the d6 square is weak, and if the knight invades this square, it would be greatly placed. But knight b5 was another dubious decision by Browne, because, as the game shows, the knight cannot actually invade this great square. Fischer plays knight f5, not only attacking d4 for the 3rd time, but also keeping an eye on the d6 square, so the knight of course cannot invade, because black would simply capture, and after c takes d, queen takes d6, black is winning a pawn. Besides that, black has an immediate threat. At the moment, the b5 knight defends the d4 pawn, but black threatens a6, kicking out the knight, and after knight c3, the pawn will fall. So white must do something about this threat, and the best thing he can do is to eliminate the knight, the annoying knight. And there are 2 ways of doing that. He can play g4, but this looks dangerous, of course, because it terribly weakens white's king side. Black, in this case, captures on e3. It's true, the d4 pawn isn't weak anymore, it is defended by the e3 pawn, but now black has a new target of attack. Now the base of the pawn chain is e3, and black has numerous attacking ideas. White's king side is weakened, so black can play h5. This is one of the ideas, completely destroying white's king side. Another idea is to play bishop h6 and queen g5, attacking the base of white's pawn chain in accordance with Ra1 Nxb4's teaching, who taught us to attack the base of the pawn chain. He can also attack the tip of the pawn chain with b6. So all this looks dangerous. White king might get in trouble. For this reason, instead of g4, Browne plays bishop g4. So he's going to exchange his bishop for this annoying knight, and maybe after that the knight can invade d6. But of course, Fischer prevents it. He plays a6, attacking the knight. Now Browne, of course, eliminates this annoying knight, but Fischer, as Browne is ready to invade the d6 square, of course, instead of capturing the bishop, he captures the knight. It might seem that black has weak doubled pawns now and white has positional advantage, but it isn't the case. It's true, the pawns are weak, but it isn't so easy for white to attack the pawns. While what is more important is that after black captures on b5, the a file opens, and without making a single move, the rook turns into a very active piece. Now, besides the d4 pawn, a2 pawn is another weakness. So white has two weaknesses now in his position, and his bishop is still under attack. So Browne must spend another tempo to save it. Bishop c2 followed. So how should black continue? Probably the best move for black would have been b4. On b5, the pawn might turn into a target of attack, so white could have played queen d3, for example, attacking it, while on b4 the pawn is safe, it's defended by the knight. Besides that, of course, the pawn blockades white's pawns, fixes the weakness on a2, and after that black can increase the pressure on the a file. But instead of b4, Fischer plays rook a3, which is also quite strong, but it's not the best move. However, black still has a big advantage. By playing rook a3, Fischer blockades the a2 pawn, and he's ready to increase the pressure with queen a5, if needed rook a8, and at first sight, the a2 pawn is doomed. However, now we can see why b4 was the best move, because now Browne plays b4 himself, preventing queen a5 and also vacating the b3 square for the bishop, and the bishop will defend the a2 pawn. And we have reached another critical position. So black is definitely better, but he must play energetically, otherwise his initiative might disappear. You can pause the video and find how Fischer increases the pressure on white's position and develops his initiative. So Fischer finds another attacking resource. The f-pawn moves forward, f5. Of course, it terribly weakens the e6 pawn, it turns into a backward pawn on the half-open file, but as black has the initiative, white has no time to attack the pawn. White must think about the defense. So what is important is that by playing f5, Fischer creates an immediate threat of f4. So f4, bishop takes f4, after which the d4 pawn will fall. So black can think about f4 right away, next move, or as is the case in our game, he will keep preparing this, increasing the pressure. So how should white react? f4 is the possible threat. He cannot play f4 himself. That would be a terrible blunder. Do you see why? Of course, it's a simple tactics, so by playing f4, white has terribly weakened the dark squares, and this diagonal in particular, so black would simply capture the bishop, and if the queen captures, then after bishop takes d4, white is losing the queen. For this reason, after f5, Browne plays bishop b3, not only defending the pawn, but also closing the rook's rank. The rook isn't attacking the bishop anymore, and next move, white can play f4 now, preventing black from playing it. But Fischer increases the pressure. He plays queen f6, creating two threats. First, he is attacking the d4 pawn for the third time. So white has no time for f4. And the second threat is to push the pawn forward to f4, after which so the queen will also support the f pawn, so white cannot even capture on f4, so he is losing a piece. So at first sight, it might seem that black is winning material, but it isn't the case. Browne finds a way of retaining the material balance. And one more time, we can see why b4 for black instead of rook a3 was stronger. The weakness of the b5 pawn tells now. Browne plays queen d3, opening the retreating diagonal for the bishop, saving it. So after f4, the bishop will be saved, and also attacking the b5 pawn. Of course, capturing the pawns, either the d4 pawn or b4 pawn, doesn't work, because the b5 pawn falls. Let's say after knight takes b4, white captures, and the knight together with the pawn falls under attack, and after this pawn falls, c5 pawn turns into a passed pawn, and if the knight captures on d4, of course the knight defends the pawn, but white can remove it and then capture the pawn, again attacking b7. So that would be in white's favor. For this reason, Fischer of course doesn't capture these pawns. Instead, he plays f4 with a tempo, attacking the bishop, kicking it out, and on this square the bishop was defending the pawn, and besides that the pawn needs just one more move to move to f3 and threaten to destroy white's kingside. Browne must save his bishop, and the bishop retreats to c1, attacking the rook. And we have reached another critical position. Black has no time to capture on d4 because his rook is under attack. So what should black do? You can pause the video and find the only way black can retain his big advantage. The only way to keep the initiative was the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes b3, which Fischer didn't play. So after rook takes b3, white has only two options, either a takes b or queen takes b3, but in both cases black gets great compensation for the exchange. After queen takes b3, of course, black captures with a tempo, attacking the queen, removing the d4 pawn, after which his pawn center becomes mobile, the pawns can move forward. After the queen moves, black plays f3, creating terrible threats. Knight e2, check with the discovered attack on the rook is one threat. F takes g, destroying white's kingside and launching a devastating attack is another threat, and he can combine this with the advance of his central pawns, which will smash everything on their way. And if instead of queen takes b3, white captures with the pawn, then capturing with the knight looks dubious, because white can play bishop b2, pinning the knight, but instead black can capture with the queen, getting the first pawn for the exchange. So the rook is under attack, b4 is under attack, white must exchange, but after bishop takes d4, the rook is still under attack, the pawn is still under attack, this pawn will fall. Black will get the second pawn for the exchange, actually after that getting material advantage. c5 most probably will also fall, and white will get material advantage, and positionally he will be better because his mobile pawn center will move forward, of course. But strangely, Fischer missed this opportunity. He didn't capture on b3. Instead, his attacked rook retreats to a6. But after this, he loses his initiative. But it's true, he is still slightly better. Black is now ready to capture on d4, that's why bishop b2, defending the pawn, and as we know, of course, capturing on d4 is dubious because the knight would be pinned, and capturing on b4 is also bad because of queen takes b5. That's why Fischer plays f3. He is still better, and he creates a threat of f takes g, that's why Browne prevents it with g3. The pawn is still under attack, but Fischer defends it indirectly. He plays queen f5, not only attacking the queen, but also attacking h3. So white cannot capture on b5 because after queen takes h3, the white king would get checkmated. So white has no choice. He must exchange the queens. He captures on f5. Of course, black cannot capture with the e-pawn because d5 would fall, so he has only two moves, either rook takes f5 or, as is the case in our game, capturing with the g-pawn. Now black is ready to capture on d4, that's why rook d1 defending it. And finally Fischer wins a pawn. Knight, now that the white queen cannot capture on b5, the knight captures on b4. However, Fischer's extra pawn is doubled. He actually has two doubled pawns. He has the backward pawn. So the engine shows that black has only a slight advantage. And Browne plays rook e1, putting pressure on the backward pawn, which is actually at the moment defended. But it isn't so simple. Actually, Browne's move contains a threat, a simple threat, but Fischer misses it. So first, it's important to notice that the a2 pawn is untouchable. If black tries to win the second pawn, he would get a worse position after a simple combination: rook takes e6, rook takes e6, and bishop takes d5. The rook is pinned, white is ready to capture it, and the knight is also under attack. Black must save the rook, and let's say after king f7, white first captures the knight. Next move he will capture the rook, and he will get a better position. So knight takes a2 doesn't work. The best move for black would have been to reinforce his main weakness with king f7, but Fischer misses white's threat. He thought that the pawn is defended anyways, so he keeps playing actively. Instead of king f7, he pushes the pawn forward, but that was a terrible blunder. Do you see why? So the simple threat white created with rook e1 was a3, attacking the knight, and it turns out that the knight has only one square, c6, but on c6 it closes the rook's line and white gets the pawn back, after which he gets a big advantage. Because not only he gets the pawn back, also the d5 pawn falls, so white wins a pawn, and this is a very important pawn. After the fall of this pawn, his d4 pawn will turn into a passed pawn. There is no way black can defend the pawn. So if he plays rook d8, white simply plays rook d6, and the pawn falls anyways. Let's say after the exchange of the rooks, there is no way to defend the pawn. Not only d5, but also f3 after that also falls, and white is winning. For this reason, Fischer doesn't play rook d8. Now he will try to hold this bad position, maybe almost lost position. So he captures on g3. White could have recaptured, but in this case f2 check might be annoying. That's why Browne makes even stronger move. He, instead of recapturing on g3, he captures on d5, creating a terrible threat of rook takes c6 with the discovered check. Fischer captures on f2 with a tempo, and then parries the threat of rook takes c6 by moving his king away from the bishop's diagonal. Of course, capturing on f3 would be a mistake because of a simple tactical shot. Knight takes d4 and the bishop is pinned. It's attacked for the second time. The rook also falls under attack, so that's in black's favor. That's why Browne didn't capture on f3. So there is no need to hurry with this capture. This pawn looks doomed anyways, so he plays rook e3, moving the rook away from e6 so that it doesn't fall under attack, and attacking f3 for the second time. And it seems that white is ready to capture on f3. So he is, after that he will have almost winning position, and black's position is passive, so black's only chance is to immediately create some counter chances, to create some tactical complications, and that's exactly what Fischer does. He plays b4, attacking the a3 pawn, and after a takes b, he gets at least some activity. His rook will invade the second rank, pinning the bishop, and the white king is also on the second rank, and his knight is activated. Knight takes b4, attacking the bishop. So if white captures on b7, then the rook invades a2 with a tempo, threatening to capture the pinned bishop, and it turns out that it isn't so easy to defend this bishop. So the bishop is pinned, it isn't actually defending the d4 pawn, so white cannot play rook b1 to defend it, because d4 would fall in this case. If he plays rook d2, bishop h6 is possible, and black is winning the exchange. And finally, if he plays rook b3, defending the bishop, attacking the knight, then knight c2 is possible, attacking the pawn for the second time. And remember, the bishop isn't defending it, and it isn't so easy. The engine still gives advantage to white, but for human it isn't easy to play. For example, if white moves the king away in order to unpin his bishop, let's say after king g3, the pawn might move forward, which looks a little bit dangerous. For this reason, Browne doesn't capture on b7. Instead, he eliminates this annoying pawn, so that after the white king moves away from f2, the black pawn, which has disappeared, cannot move to f2. So white is now up a pawn. And what a pawn! A dangerous passed pawn, which is ready to move. But Fischer keeps creating some counter chances. He plays rook a2, pinning and attacking the bishop. That's why rook b3, defending it, attacking the knight, and knight c6, attacking the d4 pawn. For this reason, white, of course, cannot capture on b7. Instead, Browne unpins his bishop. Actually, he unpins both of his bishops by playing king g3, moving away from this x-ray and from this x-ray. And now he is ready to capture on b7. That's why Fischer plays rook g8, creating a threat of bishop takes d4, discovered check. That's why king f4. Again, white is ready to capture on b7, but rook f8 check, and after king e4, Fischer defends the b7 pawn with rook f7. So what should white do next? b7 is attacked once, defended once, so Browne plays bishop g4. He is going to attack the pawn for the second time when the right time comes. Rook e7 check follows, king d3, and Fischer attacks the d4 pawn for the third time. Rook a4. How should white react? If he makes the most natural move, which is d5, pushing the attacked pawn, the passed pawn, forward, then that might run into, so after d5, the fourth rank opens, and black can play knight b4 check. The white king is actually cut on the e-file, is also cut on the fourth rank, and knight b4 check also attacks the pawn, the d5 pawn, and the engine says that the best thing white can do in this position is to sacrifice the exchange by capturing the knight, after which white is still slightly better. Because if instead of that white plays king c4, defending the pawn, then black can give perpetual check. He can give check, discover check, and after king b5, it turns out that the white king cannot run away, cannot escape from checks. Rook a5 check, rook a6 check, rook a5 check, rook a4 check. For this reason, Browne doesn't make the obvious move d5. Instead, he makes a stronger move. So as we have just seen, this rook is really annoying. It's one of black's most active pieces, so he is up a pawn, so exchanges are in his favor. So he plays rook a1, offering the exchange of the rooks. And the d4 pawn, of course, black cannot capture it with the minor piece, because his rook is under attack. And if black exchanges the rooks, which at first sight looks like the only move, what else can black do? If black exchanges the rooks, then the position becomes very simple, and white easily converts his extra pawn. Of course, he cannot play d5 right away because his bishop falls, but first he will play bishop c3, then he will push the pawn forward with a tempo, the bishops would be exchanged, the position would become very simple, then the pawn will move to d6, again with a tempo, protected by the c5 pawn, then when the right time comes it will move to d7, supported by the bishop, the weakness of b7 will also tell, and white will easily win. For this reason, instead of exchanging the rooks, Fischer realizes that his only chance is to sacrifice the exchange in order to eliminate this dangerous passed pawn. So he captures on d4 with the rook. Rook takes d4 check, and according to Browne, the real battle begins only now. He has won the exchange, but let's see what happens next. Fischer will resist very well, and he will find some miraculous ideas, as we will see. Bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4. The rook and the pawn are under attack, but Browne first saves the rook with a tempo, check, and then saves the pawn, rook b5. Browne writes that now his main idea, his plan, is to eliminate the b7 pawn. And if this pawn falls, of course, the c5 pawn will turn into a passed pawn. While Fischer's main plan, the only plan he has, is to try to set up an ideal defensive formation. So Fischer plays bishop f2 now. There is no need to hurry with bishop c8. There is nothing black can do anyways to prevent it. Black has no active plan. So Browne first plays bishop f5, knight e5 check, king c3, bishop e1 check, king d4, knight c6 check, king c4, bishop h4. We will see the idea of this move a little bit later. And finally, Browne invades the c8 square, attacking the pawn and forcing black to make an ugly move, a passive, moving the knight to a passive square, but that's the only way of holding the b7 pawn. So now Browne plays rook a2. So the most natural looking move would have been rook a7, of course, attacking the pawn for the third time. This was actually possible, but the engine says that it's possible, but from human perspective it looks a little bit dangerous, because black could have replied with rook c7, attacking the bishop, and it's true, white removes this pawn. His pawn turns into a passed pawn, but and now we see the idea of bishop h4. After bishop e7, it turns out that white pieces are actually tied. They cannot move. The bishop cannot move because it's pinned. The rook would fall. This rook cannot move because the bishop would fall, so it's tied to the defense of the bishop. This rook is tied to the defense of the c5 pawn, cannot move either. The engine, of course, knows how to untie and how to win this position, but for a human it's not so easy. For example, a human can make a mistake. He can make the most natural move, c6, hoping to untie his position. Now everything is defended, the bishop is defended, c5 isn't under attack, the rook is free to move, but it isn't the case because black has a simple answer, a tactical shot. Knight takes c6, attacking the rook. And it turns out that the rook cannot move. If it moves, let's say after rook a2, there is an x-ray. Black would play knight a7, discover check, capture the rook, and then the bishop. For this reason, after knight takes c6, white must capture the bishop, but the rook falls, and we get an absolutely equal position. So, for this reason, instead of obvious rook a7, Browne plays rook a2. He prepares rook b2. So instead of attacking the pawn for the third time from a7, he's going to attack it from b2. But Fischer doesn't let him do it. He plays rook c7, forcing the bishop to retreat. Bishop g4. And bishop e7 follows, attacking the pawn for the second time and creating a threat of b6. The pawn is pinned, so after b6, black will attack the pawn for the third time. White, of course, won't be able to capture on b6 with the pawn, and if he captures on b6 with the rook, black will capture on c5. The engine still says that white is completely winning after that, but from human perspective, black succeeds in this variation in exchanging a pair of pawns, which is in his favor, of course. After that, it would be more difficult for white to convert his advantage. For this reason, and also by playing bishop e7, Fischer actually sets a trap. So he's ready to play b6, and if white prevents this in the most natural way, so the first, what would you play if you knew that black is ready to push the pawn to b6? The first move that comes to mind is rook a7, pinning the pawn, but that would be a mistake because Fischer prepared a trap. Do you see his reply? He would have captured on c5, and after rook takes c5, b5 check with the discovered attack on the rook, and after king takes b5, rook takes a7, again the position is absolutely equal, black saves the game. For this reason, as black threatens to push the pawn to b6 and rook a7 doesn't work, Browne prevents b6 in a different way. He plays king d5, unpinning his pawn. Now, of course, b6 runs into c takes b. Knight, so there is no need to keep the knight on d8 because b7 is attacked only once and it's defended once, so Fischer activates the knight, but rook b2, attacking the pawn for the second time, forcing the knight to return to a passive square. Black is tight, but so Browne writes that he shouldn't hurry now. He will try to wear down his opponent physically and psychologically, and also gain time on the clock. So he starts making a kind of waiting moves for a while. He plays rook b1 without any specific purpose. Bishop f8, there is nothing Fischer can do anyways, so Fischer also makes waiting moves. Rook b2, bishop e7, rook g2, creating the x-ray. Fischer moves the king away from the g file. Rook a2, occupying the open file. The king returns to g7, and now again it's time for action. Rook a8. Creating a threat. Do you see what white's threat is? He is ready to play rook c8, after which the rooks will be exchanged, so the black rook has no squares to move, and after the exchange of the rooks, of course, it will be much easier for white to convert his advantage. That's why Fischer must prevent this, and that's exactly what he does. He plays bishop h4, opening the rook's way. Now rook c8 runs into will be responded by rook f7. Rook b8 follows, so attacking the pawn for the second time and tying the knight to the defense of b7. Now black cannot activate this knight. Rook f7. Fischer tries to get some activity. At least he tries to activate his rook, now that the knight defends the pawn. Rook b2 follows, king h6, rook b6 check, the king returns to g7, rook b3. Again, this move creates a threat, the same threat to exchange the rooks. Rook f3 is threatened. After which, where can the black rook move? e7 is impossible because it would close the bishop's diagonal and the knight would fall. The only square would be c7, but in this case, again, rook c8 would follow and the rooks would be exchanged. So it seems that white is finally winning. It's time for black to resign, but Fischer keeps finding the only moves that let him continue the resistance. Do you see the move? White threatens rook f3. He plays h5. So, attacking the bishop, white has no time to play rook f3, his bishop is under attack, and the pawn is untouchable because of rook f5 check, and the bishop falls. So, the bishop moves to c8, attacking the pawn for the third time. Bishop e7, however, follows. And it turns out that if white captures on b7, turning his pawn into a passed pawn, this pawn will fall too. After bishop takes b7, as the bishop is attacking c5, the rook will give a check and the pawn will fall. The engine still shows that white is winning in this position, but again, from human perspective, white succeeded in exchanging a pair of pawns and it would be more difficult for white to convert his advantage. That's why, as Browne writes, he wants to capture the b7 pawn without losing the c5 pawn. after which his pawn will survive and move forward. For this reason, he doesn't capture on b7 right away. Instead, as after bishop takes b7, black plays rook f5 and captures the pawn, he plays rook b5, defending the pawn. And now he is ready to capture on b7 and his pawn will survive, but on b3 the white pawn was defending h3. Now it doesn't, and the only defender is the bishop, but the bishop is going to capture on b7. That means the pawn will not be defended, so Fischer exploits that. Rook f3. And after the fall of this pawn, Fischer also will get a passed pawn. Browne agrees to exchange his h3 pawn for the b7 pawn, because his c5 pawn will turn into a passed pawn, so he captures on b7. Fischer in his turn captures on h3. Now both of them have passed pawns. But Browne's pawn looks more dangerous, because it's more far advanced, and he immediately pushes it forward with the immediate threat of c7. That's why Fischer plays rook c3, stopping the pawn. What should white do next? Browne again decides to exchange the rooks. So this rook is quite active, so he plays rook a8 with the idea of rook a4, rook c4, and the rooks will be exchanged. Fischer pushes his pawn forward. That's his only chance. This pawn is his only chance for the counterplay is related to this pawn. Rook a4 follows, h3, rook c4, attacking the rook, but h2. So white has no time to capture the rook because black is threatening to promote. Rook b1, taking the promotion square under control, and now Fischer has no choice. He must exchange the rooks, because if he moves the rook away, white would simply push the pawn forward. But he exchanges. White is forced to capture with the king. Now his king doesn't control the d6 square, and Fischer gets a chance to play bishop d6, taking the c7 square under control and preventing c7. The king returns to d5 with a tempo attacking the bishop, and bishop g3 follows. And we have reached another critical position. What should white do next? His pawn cannot advance because the bishop stops it. His king cannot move forward either, because the knight together with the bishop control both of these squares. And another problem white has is that his strongest piece, the rook, is tied to the defense. It cannot leave the first rank. It must protect the promotion square. So how does Browne solve this problem? You can pause the video and try to find it. He reroutes his bishop to the long diagonal, bishop c8. The idea is to play bishop h3, bishop g2. The bishop will take the promotion square under control, after which the rook will be free to move. What should black do? Fischer brings the king closer to the passed pawn. He plays king f7. Bishop h3, king e7. Rook c1. Browne isn't in a hurry to play bishop g2, we will see why. So he plays rook c1, supporting the pawn, but it turns out that he cannot push the pawn forward anyways. Fischer plays king f6, so if c7 would be a blunder because black simply captures and white cannot recapture because the pawn promotes. And let's see why Browne didn't make the intended move bishop g2, which is an obvious move, taking the square under control. The rook is free. However, on h3, the bishop controlled this diagonal, in particular the e6 square. And now that it has moved to g2, black can activate the knight. There is no need for black to keep the knight on d8 anymore, because the only reason he moved the knight to this passive square was to defend b7. Now there is no pawn on b7, so black can activate the knight, and together with the bishop it will control this important square. And Browne didn't want to let his opponent activate the knight, so instead of bishop g2, he plays rook a1. King e7, rook f1, so Browne keeps playing cat and mouse with Fischer. And now it's time to activate the knight. So knight f7 follows. The idea is to play knight g5 and after bishop attacking the bishop, and after the bishop moves, the e6 square will be available for the knight, and the knight will be quite active. So as knight g5 is coming and white will move the bishop away anyways, Browne does that in advance. Bishop g2 follows, knight g5, we already know the idea, knight e6 with the blockade of c7 is coming, and what should white do? So c7 will be, after knight e6, will be under complete control of black, and Browne, however, tries to break the blockade. So the king will join the fight for this vital square. King c5 follows. Knight e6 check, king b6. Bishop c7 check, king b7. However, at the moment black still has the control over this square, because he has two pieces which control this square. Bishop d6 follows and bishop d5. Of course, Browne would love to exchange his bishop for the knight, after which his pawn will easily move forward, so black must avoid the exchange. He plays knight c5 check. And king b6. Now Browne has a threat. He is ready to finally push the pawn forward, and after bishop takes c7, the knight would fall. The bishop wouldn't defend it anymore. So what can black do? King d8 trying to control this square doesn't work for the same reason. c7 check. The king, of course, cannot capture, and after bishop takes, again, the knight falls. That means, to parry the threat of c7, black must move the knight. But where? If he moves the knight, white would still play c7. So that means he must move the knight with a tempo. So the only move is knight a4 check. If the king moves to b7, which looks like the obvious move, the knight will return to c5 with a check. That's why king a5. Knight c5, king b5, and now again white threatens c7. That's why king d8. Now, if c7, of course, black will capture with the king. That's why Browne activates his rook. Rook f7 now follows, occupying the 7th rank. Fischer has no active moves. He plays king c8, and we have reached another critical position. White has an absolutely winning position, according to the engine. You can pause the video and try to find the easiest way to victory. So the simple move, rook h7, was winning on the spot. After this, it turns out that black is almost in Zugzwang. His bishop cannot move because it's tied to the defense of the knight and the pawn. His king cannot move either, let's say after king d8. White plays c7 with a check, which is important. It comes with a check, so black cannot move his pieces. Of course, the bishop cannot capture because the knight falls, so the only move is king c8. But after that, king c6 would be deadly. Checkmate is threatened, the bishop is under attack, so white is winning. If black plays bishop e5, taking this square under control, saving the bishop, the knight, of course, falls. As we have just seen, the bishop cannot move, the king cannot move, so the only thing black can do is to move the knight, but the knight used to control the e6 square, and after it moves, white, of course, gives a check, and that's the end. After king d8, rook d7 check, king e8. Of course, white doesn't capture the bishop because black threatens to promote. Instead, he gives another check, forcing the black king to move further away from the passed pawn, and then bishop d5, taking the promotion square under control. Now he threatens to capture the bishop. The pawn is also ready to move forward, so there is nothing black can do to parry both of these threats. White is winning. But Browne didn't make this obvious move. He probably got tired, and it's understandable. We have already reached the 88th move, so the 4th day, most probably the last day of the game. Instead of rook h7, which easily won, he makes another move which at first sight actually makes perfect sense. Why not push the passed pawn forward and vacate the c6 square for the king, and that looks deadly. However, c7 was a mistake. But it's easy to say that it was a mistake when you have the engine. In order to find the refutation, Fischer had to find like 3 miraculous study-like ideas. And now we will try to find all of them. So, c7. Why is this move a mistake? On c6, the pawn controlled the d7 square, and c7 comes without a check. So, black gets a chance to move the knight d7. And it's hard to blame Browne, because indeed it might seem that probably he thought that knight d7 was impossible, because indeed white at first sight is winning on the spot after this, because the knight and the king are placed on the same diagonal, and white can play bishop e6, pinning the knight, attacking it for the second time, threatening simply to capture it with a check, leaving the promotion square, the control over the promotion square. But it turns out that black cannot promote anyways, so let's first look what happens if black captures the pawn. So it's simple. If he captures with the bishop, the knight falls with a tempo, with a check, and then white stops the pawn. If he captures the pawn with the king, then the rook captures, again with a check. After that, the pawn will be stopped. And if instead of this, black promotes to the queen, then bishop takes d7, check follows. If the king moves to b7, white promotes with a check, so he must capture. But after that, bishop c6, discovered check, and after the king moves, the queen falls and white is winning. So probably Browne calculated all this, and he was sure that, that's just my guess, he didn't write that in his annotations. So for this reason, he probably thought that knight d7 is impossible because of bishop e6, and black cannot promote, as we have just seen. However, Fischer had a fantastic reply, a miraculous way to save this game. So you can pause the video and try to find it. What to do? White is ready to capture with a check, and black can neither capture on c7 nor promote to the queen. So the study-like idea is bishop e7, right under attack of the rook, but the bishop closes the rook's line. So by playing bishop e7, Fischer saves his bishop. Now only the rook, only the bishop is attacking it, and black is ready to promote, and he's also ready to capture on c7. So what should white do? If he, let's first look at the simple continuation. If he captures on d7 with a check, after king takes d7, black is ready to promote, so white must play rook h7. Black cannot capture the pawn because the rook captures with a check and then returns to h7, stopping the pawn, but black can promote to the queen, forcing the rook to move away from the 7th rank. Then he captures the pawn, and this is the theoretical draw. This is simple, but let's look at the main idea of bishop e7. What if white simply captures the bishop? It's a free piece, and white renews the threat of bishop takes d7 with a check, and then he will stop the pawn, but this time black can promote to the queen. And there is a big difference in the previous variation, where the promotion didn't work. The white rook was on f7, but now by playing bishop e7, Fischer has induced the white rook to move to e7. And now, after bishop takes d7 check, king takes c7, bishop c6 discovered check. Unlike in the previous variation, the rook isn't on f7, so black can play king d6, and after bishop takes h1, the rook falls, and black makes a draw in a miraculous way. So probably after Fischer played knight d7, Browne noticed the idea, Fischer's idea, the miraculous idea of bishop e7. So instead of bishop e6, he plays king c6, or maybe he was intending to make this move anyways. Indeed, one of the main ideas of c7 was to vacate the c6 square for the king. And it seems that white is still winning. So, because the bishop is under attack, the knight is under attack, both pieces are under attack, so another critical position. Fischer had foreseen everything. You can pause the video and find another study-like idea by Fischer that saves this game in a miraculous way. So the obvious move that first comes to mind is knight e5, of course, with a fork. But it doesn't work. But it isn't easy to spot why it doesn't work. Because if white captures the bishop, which is the obvious move, that would be a mistake, because after knight takes f7 check, bishop takes f7, black promotes, white promotes 2. However, this is a draw. It might seem that as the king is in trouble, white can try to checkmate him, but Fischer gives a beautiful variation after queen c5 check, king b8, queen c7 check. It seems that the deadly check is coming with checkmate, but after queen takes d5 check, king takes d5, it turns out that we have the stalemate on the board. But the problem with immediate knight e5 check with a fork is that instead of capturing the free bishop, white makes a counterintuitive move. He voluntarily refrains from capturing a free piece and instead has a brilliant move, king b6. And now he has two threats: bishop b7 checkmate and bishop e6 check, and the only move would be knight d7 and bishop takes d7 checkmate. And there is no defense there is no way black can defend against both of these threats. And now that we know that the white bishop can, in this variation, checkmate in two ways, so he can also check on this diagonal. Now that we know this, we can understand Fischer's move. Let's return to our critical position. Instead of the obvious knight e5 check right away, first Fischer promotes to the queen, sacrificing his pawn and forcing white to capture the queen. And now the bishop is in the corner of the board and it cannot give check on this diagonal. So only now Fischer plays knight e5 check with a fork. And it turns out that if white captures the bishop, then after knight takes f7 check, king c6, knight e5 check, and there is nothing white can do. His king is tied to the defense of the pawn. If he moves far away, black would simply capture it, and the knight keeps giving checks, and there is nothing white can do about it. And the game ends in a draw. For this reason, instead of the obvious king takes d6, Browne plays king b6. And he threatens bishop b7 check, followed by c8, promoting to the queen. But here comes another study-like idea by Fischer. You can pause the video and try to find how he parries this threat. And as Browne writes, he missed this move in his previous calculations. So the rook, of course, is untouchable. If black captures it, as we know, white executes his threat and wins. So Fischer's study-like idea is bishop c5 check. White has no choice, he must capture, and the idea of this sacrifice was to deflect the white king from b6, so that it doesn't control the b7 square and white doesn't have time to invade with the bishop to b7. So only now Fischer captures on f7, black is ready to capture the pawn, so Browne defends it, he renews the threat of bishop b7 check and promotion, and however there is only one threat now. And now again we can see why Fischer sacrificed this pawn and induced the white bishop to move to the corner of the board. Had the white bishop been on d5, white would have won. Now in this position he had a deadly check, actually checkmate in 1. But the bishop is in the corner, white has only one threat, bishop b7, and the knight copes with this threat. Fischer plays knight d6, taking the b7 square under control, and also creating a threat, the same threat that we already know. Knight c4 check, king c6, knight e5 check, and he will give these perpetual checks. Browne still wants to win. He plays bishop d5, preventing knight c4 check and threatening checkmate in 1. But now king d7 is possible. So the king himself defends this square, the e6 square. Bishop c6 check follows, king c8, bishop d5, renewing the threat of bishop e6 checkmate, king d7. Browne tries his last chance, bishop b3, maybe a check from this square, from this diagonal would help, but knight c8 check, king b7, knight e7. The knight controls the promotion square, it's placed on the dark square, so the light squared bishop cannot attack it. The king cannot attack the knight either, because the black king protects it. So it's a dead draw, and finally they agreed to it. And now I recommend watching a game where Browne thought for 45 minutes and made a move that shocked everyone. But first, I'd be grateful if you like this video, write comments, share and subscribe, as all this is really helpful for the channel growth.